The Quiet Guardian, written and read by Christopher Halton. For many years I had accepted, with what I flatter myself was composure, the likelihood that I should remain a bachelor. The position did not displease me. Indeed, as the only son of a prosperous industrialist, I had been afforded comforts that rendered companionship, if not unnecessary, at least negotiable. Experience had early instructed me that many attentions directed my way were animated less by affection than by arithmetic, and I confess that I came to regard admiration as one regards an invoice, something to be inspected carefully before acceptance. Thus I cultivated caution. If I erred, it was perhaps on the side of prudence. Certain acquaintances, some of them undeniably attractive, found me reserved to the point of severity, but I preferred severity to entanglement. It was therefore with some surprise that 2 years ago I discovered my composure less dependable than I had imagined. I had fractured my hand in what was, I maintain, a minor domestic mishap, though others seemed inclined to dramatize it, and was admitted briefly to the local hospital. There I made the acquaintance of Nurse Alysia de la Paz, a woman of French extraction whose manner possessed a softness that contrasted almost theatrically with the antiseptic surroundings. She was in her late 20s, dark-haired, pale, and endowed with eyes of a deep brown, which I must admit had an unsettling steadiness when fixed upon one's own. It is possible that I mistook professional attentiveness for personal warmth, yet at the time I believed I detected something more particular in her solicitude. Upon my discharge, my hand encased in plaster and my pride somewhat less comfortably so, I proposed that she join me for a modest meal. I selected the establishment with deliberation. It has always seemed to me wise, when forming new attachments, to remove from view those circumstances which might distort another's judgment. She accepted. Whether that acceptance was as uncomplicated as I chose to believe is a matter I shall presently address. It appeared to me, and I stress the phrase, for clarity is often a thing best assessed in retrospect, that our first social engagement had revealed a certain mutual inclination. Whether that inclination was precisely equal on both sides, I cannot now state with absolute confidence, but at the time I experienced what I can only describe as a renewal of spirits. For a man in his early 40s, long accustomed to solitary habits, such animation felt almost indecorous in its intensity. We agreed to meet the following afternoon for a walk along the Thames embankment near the ancient obelisk commonly known as Cleopatra's Needle. I had always found the monument curiously disquieting, a relic of a civilization older than memory, transported and set upright in London, as though time itself might be domesticated by imperial ambition. The great sphinx-like guardians at its base regarded the river with a composure that bordered upon indifference. Miss de la Paz, Alysia, as she had encouraged me to call her, appeared amused when I remarked upon the needle's history. She stood for some moments in silence before it, her expression unreadable. I recollect thinking then that the monument's antiquity lent a certain dignity to our meeting. It did not occur to me that it might lend something else. I shall not dwell at length upon the subsequent weeks. It is sufficient to say that our acquaintance ripened with a rapidity that at the time I attributed to the rare alignment of two compatible natures. I believed myself in love, and more importantly believed that she returned the sentiment. In what I considered an act of candour, though I now recognize it may equally have been vanity, I disclosed to her the full extent of my circumstances. I had long determined that any attachment must be founded upon transparency. Yet I confess that I watched her closely as I spoke, curious to observe the impression such information might produce. If I anticipated delight, I was mistaken. She received the revelation with a composure that bordered upon detachment. There was neither surprise nor animation in her expression, only a polite acknowledgement, as though I had informed her of some minor alteration in the weather. She asked no questions, she made no calculations, she merely inclined her head and changed the subject. At the time, I interpreted this restraint as proof of her sincerity. I congratulated myself upon having discovered a woman immune to vulgar temptation. It has since occurred to me that indifference and immunity are not, in fact, identical. Throughout our courtship, she remained in all observable respects the same gentle and attentive woman I had first encountered within the hospital ward. If she altered, I did not perceive it. Her manner was steady, her kindness unvaried. She declined, with a firmness softened by courtesy, every attempt I made to indulge her with costly gifts. Jewellery, travel, and even modest extravagances were met with the same mild resistance. "It is unnecessary," she would say, and there the matter would rest. At the time, I considered such refusals a species of moral elegance. Her habits appeared equally restrained. She dressed in garments of sensible cut and reasonable quality, never ostentatious, never carelessly worn. She occupied a small apartment which, she informed me, had been left to her by an aunt. I visited it only twice. It was modestly furnished, orderly, and possessed of that faint impersonal neatness one associates with temporary lodgings, though she assured me she had lived there for several years. By any ordinary description she might have been termed humble. Indeed, I frequently congratulated myself upon having found a woman so refreshingly untouched by acquisitive ambition. Whether humility was indeed the proper term, I did not at that time trouble myself to determine. Yet I cannot deny that from time to time a faint disquiet intruded upon my reflections. It was nothing tangible, no act, no word upon which one might reasonably fasten suspicion, but rather an absence of something I could not name. The apartment in particular unsettled me in ways I found difficult to articulate. Though orderly and sufficiently furnished, it bore surprisingly few traces of private history. There were no photographs, no idle ornaments, no letters left carelessly upon a desk. It was not poverty that struck me, nor even austerity, but a curious impersonality, as though the rooms awaited an occupant rather than reflected one. When I once remarked lightly upon the sparseness of the rooms, she smiled and replied that she had never been sentimental about objects. The explanation was entirely reasonable. I saw no cause to question it. As for family, she spoke of it rarely and without visible emotion. Both her parents, she told me, had perished in an avalanche in the Pyrenees while she was still a child. She had thereafter been brought to England and raised by an aunt, now deceased, from whom the apartment had descended to her. The account was delivered simply, without embellishment. If I found the narrative abrupt in its outline, I attributed that quality to the painful economy with which grief sometimes expresses itself. Still, the earlier impression, that curious absence of imprint, persisted in ways I could neither justify nor wholly dismiss. When she agreed to marry me, I resolved, in what I believe was a spirit of adult resolve, to silence such indistinct apprehensions. A man in his 40s, I reasoned, ought not to be governed by impressions more suited to adolescence. The wedding day advanced with gratifying speed, and I determined that no vague shadow of fancy should be permitted to intrude upon what promised to be a most fortunate union. In retrospect, I cannot confidently state whether the haste was hers or mine. It was about this time that I became aware, though I hesitate to state precisely when the awareness first dawned, of a singular figure whose repeated presence I could not easily explain. On several occasions, in widely differing parts of the city, I observed a man dressed entirely in black, a dark Homburg hat drawn low, a long cape of somewhat antiquated cut, and a cane upon which he appeared likely to rest one gloved hand. His beard was full and untrimmed, lending his countenance a severity that bordered upon the ecclesiastical. I cannot say that his features were distinctly visible. It was rather the impression of him that persisted. He did not approach, he did not gesture, he merely stood and looked in my direction. What unsettled me was not his attire, eccentric though it was, but the curious regularity with which he appeared. A glimpse across a thoroughfare, a stationary figure at the far end of a square, once, I am nearly certain, upon the opposite pavement as I exited my club, and always, just as I attempted to verify his presence, a passing omnibus, a delivery cart, some ordinary obstruction of movement, would intervene for a matter of seconds. When the view cleared, he was no longer there. I never saw him walk away. Indeed, in all the instances I recall, I never saw him move at all. At first I dismissed the matter as a coincidence. London affords no shortage of eccentrics, yet I could not entirely escape the impression that it was not I who observed him, but he who observed me. At length I mentioned the matter to Alysia. I had expected indulgent amusement, perhaps even gentle ridicule, and was prepared to feel faintly foolish for having allowed so trivial an occurrence to trouble me. Instead, as I described the figure, the black attire, the beard, the cane, I observed, or believed I observed, a momentary alteration in her expression. It was not fear precisely, rather a tightening, as though some interior calculation had briefly interrupted her composure. The change lasted no more than a second. Had I blinked, I might have missed it altogether. She recovered at once. "Charles, darling," she said lightly, though I thought her tone a shade too deliberate, "it is obviously some beggar waiting to seize an opportunity to ask money of you. It is what these people do." The explanation was sensible. London harbours many such opportunists, yet I could not reconcile her description with the bearing of the man I had seen. There had been nothing supplicatory in his stance. He had not looked like one who asked. He had looked like one who waited. Having accepted her explanation, and perhaps relieved to do so, I saw nothing further of the black-clad figure for many months. Indeed, the matter faded sufficiently from my thoughts that I might have persuaded myself it had been an invention of overwrought nerves, had circumstances not later revived it with unwelcome clarity. After our wedding and a brief honeymoon abroad, we took up residence in the family house in Mayfair, a substantial Georgian terrace of dark brick, with generous proportions, and an interior marked by that accumulation of generations that lends a place both dignity and weight. I had spent my childhood within those rooms. The house possessed, if I may use the expression, a settled character. Alysia assumed her new position with a rapidity that initially impressed me. She moved through the house with quiet assurance, issuing instructions with an efficiency I mistook for confidence. Yet within a matter of weeks I became aware of a subtle alteration in her manner. The gentleness I had admired at the hospital did not vanish. It receded. In its place emerged a decisiveness that, though not improper in itself, carried a sharper edge than I had previously observed. Servants who failed to anticipate her wishes were corrected in tones I found unnecessarily severe. Tradesmen delivering furniture she had selected were dismissed with a cool scrutiny that bordered upon contempt. It was the matter of the furnishings that first occasioned open disagreement between us. Several pieces long in my family, objects whose presence seemed to me inseparable from the house itself, were removed at her direction and sent away without consultation. When I ventured a mild protest, her composure fractured with surprising speed. A flash of temper, sudden and disproportionate, compelled me more than once to retreat from the discussion altogether. I told myself that adjustment to a new environment may strain even the most amiable disposition. Yet I could not entirely silence the impression that what I witnessed was not strain, but emergence. Everything about her seemed to be shifting, and not, I regret to say, in a direction that afforded me comfort. Without any explicit declaration, the centre of authority within the house appeared gradually to relocate. Decisions were made before I had considered them. Alterations were executed before I had approved them. I found myself consulted less frequently and contradicted more readily. It was not that I had relinquished control, rather that it had been assumed. It was during this unsettled period that a sealed note was delivered by hand from Sir Humphrey Milton, my private banker. The messenger, discreet and immaculately dressed, requested a written acknowledgment of receipt and departed without explanation. The contents were brief and couched in language of studied restraint. I was urged to call upon Sir Humphrey at my earliest convenience on a matter requiring confidentiality, and, most curiously, I was advised not to discuss the summons with my wife. The final stipulation disturbed me more than the urgency itself. Sir Humphrey had managed my family's affairs for many years. He was not a man given to drama, nor to unnecessary intrigue. That he should insist upon discretion, particularly with regard to Alysia, struck me as singular. I therefore contrived the following morning to inform her that I had business with my stockbroker. Hiring a hansom cab, I made my way to Sir Humphrey's offices in the Strand, my thoughts far from easy company. Upon my arrival, I was conducted without delay to Sir Humphrey's private office. A spacious and rather imposing chamber panelled in dark mahogany, the walls adorned with portraits of his predecessors, whose painted eyes seemed to observe proceedings with inherited discretion. His desk stood before a broad oval window, admitting a pale light that struggled against the room's sombre furnishings. Sir Humphrey did not rise beyond the briefest courtesy. He gestured for me to be seated, then nodded to a clerk, who placed before us a substantial leather-bound ledger, and withdrew. The banker opened the volume with deliberate care. "As you will observe, Charles," he began, his tone even but not without weight, "your recent expenditure exceeds its customary pattern." I leaned forward, unprepared for the figure upon which his finger came to rest. "Over the past 3 months," he continued, "withdrawals amounting to slightly more than £150,000 have been made in excess of your usual commitments. I confess the sum meant little at first. It was the frequency that unsettled me. Page after page bore entries of considerable value, each supported by a cheque drawn for cash. The cheques were produced. I examined them in turn. The signatures were mine, or bore such a resemblance as to defeat immediate contradiction, yet I had no recollection of issuing them. "You did not authorize these personally?" Sir Humphrey asked. "Certainly not," I replied. "My cheque-book is kept secured in my study. It is true that I sign a number of leaves in advance for household accounts and routine disbursements, but nothing approaching these amounts, and never in cash." Sir Humphrey regarded me for a moment longer than comfort allowed. "Then I must ask," he said quietly, "who besides yourself possesses access?" The answer formed itself before I had time to soften it. "My wife holds a duplicate key to the drawer." The words sounded more decisive than I felt. "I don't want to cause an issue between you and your wife, but I am assured by the staff at our Mayfair branch that it was your wife." I assured Sir Humphrey that I would take up this matter with Alysia and in any event get to the bottom of it. I returned home with greater haste than dignity and found Alysia in the drawing-room directing the placement of newly acquired furnishings. Her authority in such matters had become almost habitual. At my request, the servants withdrew, though not without evident curiosity. "Over £150,000 has been withdrawn from my account," I said, dispensing with preamble. "The cheques were among those I signed in advance for ordinary expenses. They were not authorized for cash disbursement, and certainly not in such sums." For a moment she did not reply. The colour left her face with a suddenness that might have been either genuine shock or something more calculated. When she spoke, her voice was lower than usual. "I had hoped never to trouble you with it," she said. What followed was delivered in fragments rather than narrative. During her nursing training, she claimed she had permitted a man, a photographer with whom she had briefly been involved, to take certain intimate portraits of her. She insisted it had been done out of financial desperation, tuition fees, lodgings, necessities. The arrangement, she said, had long since ended. Yet the man had retained the original glass plate negatives and kept them secured in his possession. "When he learned of our marriage," she continued, "he wrote to me. The demand had been simple, substantial payments in exchange for silence, and eventually the surrender of the plates. Each remittance," she said, "was to ensure the continued discretion of a man whose scruples had never been strong." She did not collapse at once, as I might once have imagined a confession would require. Rather, she stood very still. Then, gradually, as though strength were leaving her by degrees, she sank into a chair and covered her face. The sobbing that followed was uneven, but not entirely uncontrolled. "He says he will want more," she whispered. "He always wants more." I cannot deny that her remorse appeared sincere. The humiliation she described, were it made public, would indeed stain us both. Yet beneath my indignation on her behalf, another thought intruded. The withdrawals had been systematic, deliberate, and sustained. Still, I resolved, perhaps too quickly, that the matter required decisive action. A blackmailer once indulged seldom relinquishes advantage. If these plates existed, they must be recovered, and the man persuaded by whatever means necessary that further demands would not be entertained. Whether I was moved more by outrage, pride, or something less honourable, I did not at that moment pause to consider. The following afternoon she accompanied me, without protest, to the address she had provided, the uppermost floor of a decaying tenement in Whitechapel. The district itself seemed perpetually coated in a film of soot and fatigue. The entrance hall bore the odour of a damp plaster and something faintly acrid, perhaps chemical in origin. Affixed beside the stairwell, among various modest commercial notices, was a small but carefully painted placard. R. Davis, photographer, 4th floor. A crudely rendered hand pointed upward. The ascent was laborious. The staircase creaked beneath our weight, and more than once I placed my hand upon the wall for balance, withdrawing it faintly blackened with grime. Alysia followed in silence. At length we reached the top landing. I knocked. The door opened a fraction. A thin, unkempt man with restless eyes peered out. His expression altered sharply when he recognized Alysia, and altered again when he saw me behind her. He attempted to shut the door at once. My foot was already across the threshold. There followed a brief, graceless struggle, ending with my forcing my way into a cramped studio heavy with the smell of chemicals and stale air. A camera upon a tripod stood near a curtained backdrop. Along one wall were stacked wooden cases, plate boxes, I assumed. "Why have you brought him here?" the man demanded, his voice cracking between fear and anger. Before I could answer, Alysia stepped forward. The movement was so measured that for an instant I did not comprehend it. From within her coat she produced a small pistol, one I had never before seen, and held it with unnerving steadiness. Her expression had altered entirely. The softness I had once admired was absent. In its place was something precise and almost clinical. "We came to collect the plates," she said evenly. "You will give them to us." The photographer's gaze flicked between us. Mine, I confess, remained fixed upon my wife. "And if I refuse?" he asked. She smiled, not warmly. "My dear husband," she continued, her voice now carrying an odd, almost conversational clarity, "has threatened you with this pistol. You attempt to grapple with him. In the struggle, a shot is discharged. You are killed. My husband, overcome with remorse, then turns the weapon upon himself. She tilted her head slightly. I, in grief and hysteria, rush into the street and summon the first constable I see. She paused. As a widow, I inherit everything. There was no laughter now, only calculation. In that moment I understood, with a coldness that reached beyond anger or betrayal, that whatever doubts I had entertained in Mayfair had been tragically insufficient. I moved without conscious deliberation. The pistol was within arm's reach. Instinct, whether born of self-preservation or outrage, propelled me forward. My sudden advance unbalanced her. The weapon slipped from her grasp and skidded across the floorboards. For a fraction of a second we stood in mutual astonishment. Then she fled. The photographer, who until that moment had appeared paralyzed, followed her with remarkable agility. They reached the landing almost together. I pursued them immediately. The staircase, narrow and ill-kept, twisted downward in a crude spiral. Their descent was rapid, too rapid. I had covered scarcely half the distance when I heard a crack, sharp and splintering, followed by a cry cut short. The worn banister, long neglected, gave way beneath their combined weight. What followed occurred with dreadful brevity. A collapse of timber, a rushing void, then a heavy final sound from the floor below. I reached the breach moments later. They lay together amid shattered wood upon the tiles of the entrance hall, unmoving. It was then, and I record this without embellishment, that I perceived another figure upon the stair below the broken railing. A man dressed entirely in black, leaning lightly upon a cane. He was ascending slowly from the lower level, as though the calamity were of no particular urgency to him. His beard was dark and full. His Homburg hat cast a shadow across his features. At some instinctive awareness of my presence, he halted. He looked up. The expression he directed toward me was neither triumph nor pity. It was something closer to recognition. Then, unmistakably, he smiled, not broadly, not mockingly, simply knowingly. He resumed his ascent for several steps, and in that brief interval, some ordinary obstruction of angle or light intervened. When I rushed downward in pursuit, the staircase was empty. I never saw him again. In the days that followed, the inquest was brisk and unsentimental. The verdict returned was misadventure, a tragic collapse of unsafe railings compounded by panic and imprudence. The pistol, though recovered, was deemed incidental. The fall itself was sufficient to explain the fatality. I answered questions with composure. I omitted nothing of consequence, though I did not volunteer every impression. It was only afterwards, when solitude resumed its former dominion over the Mayfair house, that memory arranged itself with unwelcome precision. The figure upon the Whitechapel staircase had not been unfamiliar to me. The angle of the Homburg, the fall of the cape, the deliberate stillness, the cane was held lightly, almost ceremonially. It was the same man I had glimpsed months earlier across London thoroughfares, the same silent observer who had vanished whenever some mundane obstruction intervened. I had believed then that he watched me. I am no longer certain that I was the object of his vigilance. On each occasion of his earlier appearance, some decisive alteration in my life had either just occurred or was about to occur. The engagement, the marriage, the first of the unexplained withdrawals. He had never approached, never spoken, never intervened. He had merely waited, and when at last deception ripened into violence, he ascended, not hurriedly, not triumphantly, but with the calm inevitability of one whose business had reached its conclusion. I have not seen him since. Whether that absence signifies relief or only postponement, I do not presume to determine. In the months that followed, I retained the services of a discreet investigative firm to examine what little I truly knew of Alysia's past. Grief, though complicated by betrayal, does not entirely extinguish curiosity. The findings were sparse yet sufficient. Several years prior to her appearance at the hospital where we met, she had been married to a man named Jonas Armstrong, a gentleman of advancing years and comfortable fortune. His death, occurring after a brief and uncertain illness, had occasioned little public scrutiny, though certain private suspicions had circulated without ever achieving substance. His estate passed to his widow. It was not long, however, before that estate had diminished considerably. 3 years later, Alysia entered my life. She had, it seems, learned my identity through hospital staff, a matter not difficult in professional circles. The rest requires little rehearsal. As to the man I observed, the black-clad figure whose presence marked certain turning points in my affairs, I made cautious inquiries of the firm. They produced, among other documents, a likeness of Mr. Armstrong taken in middle age, the beard, the hat, the posture supported by a cane. There could be no mistake. Jonas Armstrong had been interred nearly 4 years before I first encountered him standing motionless across a London thoroughfare. I have attempted on occasion to impose rational order upon these recollections. Fatigue, suggestion, a mind unsettled by doubt. Yet I cannot escape one persistent conclusion, that I was never the intended victim. He did not watch me, he watched her. I have since found solitude a sufficient safeguard. The end.